Got breaking news out of the NFL. The Raiders and quarterback Derek Carr have agreed to a 3-year, $125 million contract extension. That's been confirmed by our NFL insider Josina Anderson. It is a deal which includes a no-trade clause, keeps Carr in Las Vegas through the 2025 season, and overall he's set to earn more than $141 million, counting his current contract. When we take a look at most game-winning drives since 2014, the year that Derek Carr left Fresno State, went to the NFL, he has just as many comeback drives and game-winning drives as Matthew Stafford, including 6 last season, en route to a Vegas postseason appearance. All right, let's bring in senior NFL reporter Jonathan Jones with more on the breaking news. So, JJ, what more can you tell us with the Derek Carr extension?
Yeah, not entirely surprising that they ultimately landed a deal between these two parties. This is something that was pretty clear would be happening in the offseason. Was just a matter of when and getting the money right for these two sides. He was entering the last year of his contract. We remember that long-term deal that he signed back in 2016, and he had about $19 million this season. And listening to Josh McDaniels at the Combine a couple of months ago, it became extremely clear that this was the move that they were going to do, that they were very impressed. Having met with Derek Carr, Josh McDaniels didn't really know Derek Carr. Dave Ziegler didn't have any reason to really know Derek Carr, the new general manager there in Vegas. But having spent some time with him, watching what he did last season with the 6 comeback drives, as you mentioned, Tommy, sort of navigating this team and captaining them through any number of controversies throughout the season and getting them into the postseason. It was a fait accompli that he was going to get a deal done, and now he gets one done where, with his new money average of around $40 million per year, or at least eclipsing that mark, he's right up there in the conversation with the top 5, 6 highest paid quarterbacks in terms of new money. A very well-deserved contract for a guy who has been rock steady for the Raiders over the years.
Yeah, those deals can always change. Obviously, you referenced that 2016 was the highest paid quarterback at the time and then was eclipsed subsequently with those deals. And that was also a year he did have an MVP type season, although he got hurt and then the Raiders went to the postseason without him. He's been there since 2014 and he is a franchise quarterback, but at points during his time is not always viewed that way. What do you think about now? You mentioned Josh McDaniels. Where does Derek Carr rank among the elites there, especially out west?
Yeah, if you look at the AFC West right now, I don't know that Derek Carr is in the top 2. In fact, I know he's not. When you look at Patrick Mahomes, when you look at Russell Wilson, and then, reasonable people can have an argument over whether you want Derek Carr or Justin Herbert there as the 3rd best quarterback in that division. All that said, you can be the worst quarterback in that division and still be a pretty good quarterback, as we're seeing right now in an arms race in the AFC West that really we haven't seen before. Is Derek Carr a top 10 quarterback in the league? If you're going to hold a draft, I'm not entirely sure. But again, the numbers speak for themselves. The consistency, the winning, what he was able to do last season, losing his top wide receiver in Henry Ruggs with that car crash, and the head coach, John Gruden, any number of other controversies that this Vegas Raiders team went through last season, that he was able to steady that ship. That says something about his leadership. It may not, and obviously does not show up on the stat sheet, but again, you look at those game-winning drives, it takes a dog at quarterback to do that. Baker Mayfield wasn't able to do that this past season. Not to compare the two necessarily, but Derek Carr has really shown year in, year out, especially with that franchise, that he can be relied upon. You mentioned that near MVP season. I think he finished in the top 3 back in 2016. And so this is a guy that maybe his name doesn't ring out. You're not going to see him on a bunch of national commercials. He doesn't have a ton of endorsements that you're going to see. This isn't a guy who's very active and vocal on social media, and so he doesn't hype himself up too much. But this is a guy who really, I think a number of NFL teams would really like to have Derek Carr. Probably more than half of the NFL teams would like to have someone who is as steady, who does show up in the 4th quarter. And I think the way that NFL contracts are, especially at the quarterback position, a well-deserved, well-earned contract for Derek.
The Silver and Black have dealt with so much as a franchise, including going from the East Bay in Oakland to Las Vegas. He's been the one constant there. Well, the draft is coming up pretty soon here, JJ. When you look at Vegas, what are some of the things that you like to see them maybe target in the draft, things to shore up so they can compete in that division?
Well, they don't have that first round pick because they went out and got Davante Adams, his very good friend, of course, from Fresno State. But this is a team that, looks pretty good right now, at least on paper, when you consider really what their needs are. They don't have a ton right now. You can look at the offensive line and you can look at the interior of the defensive line. They could go right tackle, they could go right guard because Alex Leatherwood was drafted last season. He struggled, and we know that was a John Gruden and Mike Mayock pick. Neither one of those two men are obviously still there. They still have, Miller and Good there, and so they don't necessarily have to target that right side of the offensive line in their picks. They first pick at 86, and so I don't know that you're going to get a guy who's going to be plugged in as a week one starter when you pick at 86 and then again at 136. They made a lot of hay in this offseason, in this arms race, as we talked about. Of course, they traded for Rock Yassin, sent away Yannick Ngakoue. They were able to extend Max Crosby. And so they took care of a lot of family business. Again, this was a playoff team. They made it to the postseason in a very difficult AFC West. They won that overtime game there in the final game of the regular season against the Chargers. And so they didn't think that they needed a whole lot of work. And so fortunately enough for them, they don't go into the draft necessarily needing something. Yes, they would like to add to their offensive and defensive line depth. I think just about every team in the NFL would like to do that. But simply by virtue of the moves that they have made this offseason to make them ready to win right now, they are not in a position where they're going to draft a day one, week one starter because their first pick, like I said, is at 86.
JJ, certainly appreciated. Jonathan Jones delivering the news and the insight here on CBS Sports HQ. JJ, certainly appreciated. Again, Derek Carr getting extension with the Las Vegas Raiders. This will be talked about on the Pick Six podcast with host Will Brinson and the Super Friends Ryan Wilson and John Breach. Make sure you download and follow that. All right, we continue to follow breaking news here on CBS Sports HQ, where the Raiders have locked up their franchise quarterback for another few years. Las Vegas and Derek Carr have agreed to a 3-year, $121.5 million extension that confirmed by Josina Anderson. It includes a no-trade clause, keeps him in the desert through the 2025 season, and he's set to earn more than $141 million, counting his current contract. All part of what's been an exciting offseason in the AFC West. Even though Carr obviously staying in Vegas, his team made a lot of changes. Davante Adams, Chandler Jones among those there in the division, which includes Russell Wilson, Khalil Mack, and Juju Smith-Schuster, all coming into the AFC West, which is sure to be loaded. All right, let's bring in NFL analyst Pete Prisco to the table. And Pete, what do you think about this 3-year, $121.5 million extension for Carr and the Raiders?
Well, you had to do it. You look around the quarterback landscape as we head to the draft and look at the teams that are trying to solve that position. Until you solve it, you have all kinds of issues. So Derek Carr solves it, and it gives them a guy who they know can put up big numbers, can lead them to the postseason, which he did. And it's really not that prohibitive a deal when you look at it. It's only 3 more years. Yes, the price is a little steep, probably where you rank him, but you have to go up to a certain number when you're given an extension. So I get it. I understand it. It makes sense. And you have to keep your quarterback in the fold, or else you're going to be chasing him year in and year out.
Pete, how would you describe the end of their season, which included a postseason run, to now on the precipice of the NFL draft? How do you describe it now that we've gone through the combine, through free agency, and getting ready for the next phase of that?
Well, I think it all starts with hiring the new coach. I was a big critic of Josh McDaniels when he was in Denver, and I think Josh McDaniels will be the first one to tell you that he wasn't ready for that position. I do think he's going to be much better the second time around. He's a brilliant offensive mind, and he learned from his mistakes. I think what happened to him humbled him a little bit. So you get a great offensive mind in there. You go get Davante Adams, who's a big-time receiver, and they needed to get that. And now you have Derek Carr locked up. I think it's been then they add Chandler Jones. I think this has been a really good offseason A, for Derek Carr because he gets the money and he gets a good offensive coach. B, for the team. And I think Dave Ziegler, the new general manager, stepped in and done a really good job. I like where the Raiders are heading. The problem is they're in the SEC of the NFL, the AFC West.
Yeah, we'll talk about those odds, which we flashed for a second, but we're watching video of their time at Fresno State where they were electric there. Pete, once we learn the news that Carr and Adams are going to be reunited, have you become more excited, less excited with that?
No, I like that idea. I mean, look, Adams, the whole talk about Adams being close and chummy with Rodgers, I've been told that wasn't exactly true, but he is close and chummy with Derek Carr, and they're very good friends, even though they aren't exactly the same type of person in terms of how they handle themselves, but I think they're very good friends, and it makes sense. I think that's a great move for the Raiders. Normally, I'd sit here and say, you give up a lot for an older receiver, but when you look at what this league has become, everybody's trying to win now. The landscape has changed. It's not just about stockpiling draft picks and building for the future. Everybody wants it right now. We're right now society, and the NFL is no different. And we saw that with the Rams. We're seeing it more and more with these moves made in the offseason, and I don't think the Raiders are any different. So I like the move to go get Adams.
Odds makers, you mentioned that this division is much like the SEC, football's version of that. Odds makers have Vegas as the fourth and worst team in the division. Do you agree with that?
Maybe on paper right now, but I could see them being ahead of the Broncos on paper as well. The Broncos still have some questions. And when you look at the top two teams, what is Kansas City going to do in terms of offense? And yeah, they have Patrick Mahomes, but they no longer have Tyreek Hill. They've added, Valdez-Scantling and Smith-Schuster in free agency, but they need to get some deep speed. That changes the dynamic of the offense. And the other thing is they're going to, change what they do offensively. So there's questions there. The Chargers have loaded up in the offseason. I love what they've done. And we know Russell Wilson's now in Denver, but they also have some issues. And so I think when you look at it on paper, they're the fourth team. But would it shock anybody to see any one of those teams win that division? I think it's going to be competitive week in and week out. It's going to be a war inside the division. And it might come down to who can stay healthy throughout the entire season, because it's going to be fun watching football fill the air because every single one of those teams can chuck it around.
Pete, get you out of here on this as you get ready for the draft, as the Raiders get ready for the draft. What do you think they'll target? Obviously not high-end picks to start with, but still some gaps to be filled there.
Yeah, there's some gaps. I think right tackle is an issue. What do you do with Alex Leatherwood? Remember, he was drafted to play right tackle, struggled there. They moved him inside the guard. Didn't play great there either, but he's now been in the system or at least been in the league for a year, new system, but he's been in the league for a year. So does he play right guard? Does he play right tackle? If he plays right guard, they need to get a right tackle. I think defensive line, the interior, they could use help inside as well. And then you look at the secondary. Remember, Rock Ya-Sin was acquired in a trade. They got him, but they need help at cornerback as well. So there's a lot to like about this team, but there's also some major questions.
Pete, certainly appreciate it. Pete Prisco joining us here with the breaking news on CBS Sports HQ. Again, it's been a lot of change out in Vegas. Just last year, you still had Mike Mayock, John Gruden. Then it was Rich Bisaccia. None of those guys are still there with that franchise. In comes Dave Ziegler, Josh McDaniels, but the one constant that has been there has been their quarterback since 2014, since he got in the league, and that would be Derek Carr. And today, DC4 gets that 3-year, $121.5 million extension. They've gotten him some help, re-signed some key players, but again, the draft will be key to get this team ready to compete with what Pete Prisco says is the SEC version of the best division in football. All right, when we come back, another 1-minute break, so that's 60 seconds. When we come back, the fantasy impact. I haven't talked too much about Davante and Derek Carr. We got Dave Richard on the other side to answer that. Maybe what about Waller and Jacobs? All right, if you're just joining us here on CBS Sports HQ, we had some breaking news out of the NFL where the Raiders and franchise quarterback Derek Carr have agreed to a 3-year, $121.5 million extension. Confirmed by our Josina Anderson. It includes a no-trade clause, keeps him in Las Vegas through the 2025 season, and overall he's set to earn more than $141 million if you include this current contract. His numbers last season, right up there with his 2016 campaign, ranking in the top 5 in both completion percentage and passing yards, game-winning drives, 6 which was second best in the NFL, but more importantly, got his team to the postseason, which they had not been there in a very long time. All right, we need to get the fantasy angle of things. We got Dave Richard joining me here, senior writer and analyst. So, Dave, what do you think about the Derek Carr extension out in Vegas?
Well, it certainly solidifies his value in dynasty leagues. You can't expect him to get dropped off the Raiders roster now. He's going to be there for the next few years. That means he's a potential starter in 1 QB dynasty leagues and a must start in Superflex and 2 QB dynasty leagues. And I also think he's going to be an interesting pick in redraft. There are going to be people that see that he's getting Davante Adams and he's going to throw the ball a lot. It is Josh McDaniels' offense. They just paid him. They're not going to pay him to hand off to Josh Jacobs. He could be in a position to finish as a top 12, if not top 8 type of fantasy quarterback. Remember this, Tommy. Last year, first 3 games of the season, he came out house of fire. His receiving core was healthy. Waller was healthy. At least 25 fantasy points and 6-point per passing touchdown leagues. Then you know what happened. Waller got hurt. Henry Ruggs left the team for terrible reasons. Now they've restocked there. Having Davante Adams, if Davante Adams brings 1,500 yards and 10 touchdowns, that's 120 fantasy points added to the bottom line of Derek Carr. If we just stuff those 120 points onto what he did last year, he's scoring over 400 points and finishing as a top 5, top 6 type of fantasy quarterback. He does have upside to get there. I think fantasy managers are just going to be a little too gun-shy about him. They're going to compare him with Aaron Rodgers on draft day. Which quarterback do I take first? The guy that's been the MVP, the guy that's been awesome for the past 2 years, but he just lost his top receiver, to the other guy. It's going to be an interesting dilemma where fantasy managers who wait on a quarterback are going to have to make a tricky decision.
All right, it's interesting. Last season averaged just under 18 fantasy points per game. And Dave, he was a guy at times that was streamed and talked about. You guys obviously had decisions to make. But coming into this season, you mentioned at least one instance where maybe it's Aaron Rodgers and Derek Carr. Do you think he stays on rosters season long without having to maybe deal with a little bit of yo-yoing there?
That's a good question, and I think it's really going to come down to how he operates in the first 3 or 4 weeks of the season. Remember, the draft capital for Derek Carr, assuming it's a 1-quarterback league, it's not going to be very high. You're talking about round 9 or later to get Derek Carr on your fantasy roster. So people in those types of leagues, they'll settle on a quarterback, whether it's him, Rodgers, Jalen Hurts, maybe one of the second-year quarterbacks. Whoever was performing well at the beginning part of the year, they're going to stick with that guy, and Derek Carr could find the waiver wire if he gets off to a slow start. That's when I would be excited to pounce on Derek Carr off the waiver wire and get him for free because somebody else dropped him, because I do expect him to eventually have some good weeks, especially once the bye weeks kick in, injuries take a toll. The other thing to worry about is in those super flex leagues, in those 2-quarterback leagues, well, he's not going to be taken in round 9 there, Tommy. He's going to be taken probably closer to round 4, and that's where the commitment's going to have to be made. And even if Derek Carr does get off to a slow start in one of those leagues, you're going to have to ride it out with him because quarterback at a mega premium because you can start 2.
All right, consensus on fantasy, CBSSports.com, 14. I think your last projections had him at 13 in your rankings there, Dave. A couple more before I let you go. Obviously, I think we know what Davante and Darren Waller bring to the table, when they'll be selected. What about Hunter Renfrow? They could target a receiver late in the draft, but what do you think about Renfrow's chances here with Derek Carr slinging it around still?
I just think that with Davante Adams now in Las Vegas, that guy's going to soak up 150 targets. And if Darren Waller stays healthy, he's going to soak up close to 100 targets. What's left for Hunter Renfrow? As a slot receiver in a Josh McDaniels offense, at first I loved it. I had him as a number 2 fantasy receiver, and then as soon as they traded for Davante, that ship sailed. I think he's a number 3 receiver in PPR. I'd be okay taking him in round 8. And in non-PPR leagues, he'll go even later than that. I do not see upside to what he finished last year with.
And lastly, what about Josh Jacobs?
I think Jacobs is headed for a little bit of a downturn, especially in PPR leagues. We saw last year, we just talked about it on our podcast, Tommy. He had 24 receptions from Thanksgiving on. That's really when he started to get going. John Gruden was out of there, and you saw the Las Vegas offense start to lean on Josh Jacobs as a pass catcher. What do we know about Josh McDaniels and his decade plus in New England? He likes to specialize as running backs, and Jacobs, a tremendous running downs guy, great at the goal line, could flirt with over 1,300 yards and double-digit touchdowns, but he's not going to get that type of passing volume. I think Derek Carr is going to be more of a downfield thrower. Again, Davante Adams is there. Darren Waller is there. What do you think they're going to do in the red zone? Maybe it'll be different when they're like right at the 1 or the 2, but when they're at the 10, man, he's going to find an easy target from one of those 2 guys for a touchdown. That'll hurt Josh Jacobs a little bit. I would draft him as a number 2 fantasy running back, and I wouldn't look at him until at least round 3.
Sounds fun. Those Vegas mock-ups are going to be interesting with all you guys taking a look at that with the draft, after the draft, and of course before the season. Dave Richard joining us here on CBS Sports HQ. Dave, certainly appreciate it. Part of the Fantasy Football Today team. Dave Richard, Heath Cummings, Jamie Eisenberg, Adam Azer, and a slew of guests on the podcast. And of course, during football time, the show on HQ, FFT. Download and follow the guys.
Do you want a sports network that delivers everything that matters about the game? The highlights, the picks, the instant analysis, no yelling, no fake debates, no politics. Hit the subscribe button and never miss a moment.